I think we will now begin by hearing from Harry. And when I spoke to Harry earlier, he did tell me that actually, I think when he was a student, he was a magician. So I really look forward to the magic that he's going to sprinkle into his presentation. Thank you very much. Harry, over to you.
Thank you, Kira. I can't promise too many coins behind people's ears over Teams, but I'll see what I can do. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. And I'm going to kick us off in terms of putting net zero on the balance sheet by the concept of internal carbon pricing, which is something that we've worked on in Hull and East Yorkshire to see as a real solution of how we can get more net zero projects through the decision making process. We'll start with looking at sort of the current state of play and why we think internal carbon pricing might be a good idea to alleviate some of the issues that we're seeing at the moment by thinking like an accountant. I'll then go on to talk about a bit more of what internal carbon pricing is, how to set a price, how to use a price, and what the next steps might be for ourselves or for yourselves if you wanted to join us on this journey. So the current state of play across the public sector and largely within local authorities, we're really quite set in terms of things like climate emergency declarations. We've got an awful lot of really bold and ambitious strategies and action plans. And there's a raft of really positive grant-funded climate change and net zero projects going on, especially with the public sector decarbonisation projects, but also with things like the Towns Deal or the Levelling Up Fund projects as well. Where we're not quite hitting that bar of what we need to hit to achieve the aims in our strategies and declarations, though, is in those non-grant funded projects, and also getting net zero and climate change built into the projects that our colleagues in other services and departments are cracking on with as well. And we need both of those to be ramped up in order to meet those ambitions that we've set out. So why is that the current state of play? Well, having a look at what happens when we try and get net zero projects through the decision making process, we're quite good at putting the costs of our project in the language and in the numbers that decision makers understand, especially our finance officers, section 151 officers, as perfectly demonstrated by that stock image of an accountant on that slide. But we're probably not quite as good at articulating the benefits in a language and in the numbers that those same decision makers understand. So the question then becomes, how do we tackle that issue and make sure that we're articulating the benefits just as well as we're articulating the costs? And that is why we decided that we need to start thinking like accountants. And when I say we, that's a collaboration between the North East and Yorkshire Net Zero Hub, the Hull and East Yorkshire Business Growth and Skills Hub, Hull City Council, and the East Riding of Yorkshire Council. So we brought in expert external consultancy from Anthesis and said, let's think about how we can get net zero better aligned to the decision-making process as a tool that we can use and a mechanism that we can use across the public sector, especially within local government. And so we thought we would start with, how are we already thinking like an accountant? Well, as mentioned earlier, we're really good at understanding our costs, both upfront and running costs, because let's be honest, net zero projects can be quite expensive. But we're also quite good at articulating the long-term revenues and analysing the cost savings of our projects. I'm thinking particularly in terms of the profit shares that we can get into the contracts for EV charge points, or the energy bill reductions that come with retrofit projects. But are we as good at articulating how our net zero projects achieve targets, both internal and statutory, and how achieving those targets can help avoid abatement costs of saying, well, you've got 50 tons of carbon emissions in 2050, but we've got a net zero target for 2050, so you're going to have to spend some money to get them to zero unless you can undertake some net zero projects now. And we also need to be much better at articulating the social value benefits of our net zero projects, as that's something that many public sector organisations are increasingly putting at the forefront of their minds. So in summing up all these things, we figured that one possible route to taking all those areas where we're a bit weak and making them as strong as our strengths is through internal carbon pricing. So what do we mean by internal carbon pricing? Well, put simply, it's any sort of way really of putting a financial value on an activity that emits or saves carbon. So typically you'll see that in pounds per tonne of CO2 equivalent. And there are two versions really of an internal carbon price. There's what's known as the implicit cost or the mitigation cost, which is all about saying this is an activity that will save carbon, planting a tree, installing a solar panel. It costs X much and it saves Y amount of carbon. So you do a simple X over Y, and that's your implicit cost. Or there's a slightly more complicated version, which is the social cost, which instead of talking about the cost of reducing emissions, talks about the financial damage that the emissions you are putting into the atmosphere are doing. And that's the damage on things like health, infrastructure, prosperity, livelihoods. And that doesn't have as nice and neat a formula, but there are some academic boffins, particularly in America, who are trying to constantly update what they think the social cost of carbon might be. Now, there are probably two sort of realms in which you would use either of these. If your focus is on that meeting of a net zero target, then that implicit cost, that mitigation approach is probably the way to go. If you are focused more on understanding the social impacts of decisions, maximizing social value, then probably that social cost price is the way to go. The UK government have a very strong preference for that implicit cost approach. They did a full review leading up to 2021 where they made that sort of statement and that stake in the ground, because they see that meeting the net zero targets as their primary aim, and therefore what the primary aim of much of the other rest of the public sector should be as well. So that's what internal carbon pricing is, but what do we need to think about when we're deciding how to set an internal carbon price? Next slide, please, Katie. There are four main things that you've got to be aware of when thinking about setting an internal carbon price. First of all, is it high enough to make a difference? There's no point having an internal carbon price of £1 per tonne because you can't really do much with that pound. Is it low enough there to be acceptable and palatable to your colleagues who might look at it and think this is a bit of an imposition? So it's got to be lowable to be tolerable enough. Is it robust enough to be defensible if someone challenges you about what you're doing and why you're doing it? And is it flexible enough to be able to be used in different circumstances for different projects and maybe change over time as the impacts of carbon change over time and the cost of different net zero projects start over time? Which is why it's probably useful to have external benchmarks to say, well, this is a number that other places have used, and it's high enough, low enough, robust enough, and flexible enough for them. So a number similar to that should match all of those things for us as well. And particularly if you're going down that social cost route, external prices are probably the only real way to go because of the difficulty in coming up with that pricing formula. So what are some of these external benchmarks? Well, the UK government conveniently has two. As part of its green book, it's got its traded carbon price, which focuses on what big industry and the official carbon markets might do. So that's 60, 70, 80 odd pounds. And then they've got their non-traded price, which is what they think that the rest of society, organisations, the rest of the public sector are probably going to have to spend on net zero activity. And that's in the realm of sort of 1, 2, 3 odd £100. The World Bank has some interesting numbers if you're particularly interested in having more global comparisons rather than just within the UK. Their numbers were last reviewed in 2017, so that $40 to $80 amount, probably a little bit out of date now. Networking for Greening the Financial System have a really interesting sort of suite of different prices that match different scenarios and targets. So if your organisation has a target that is slightly different from the UK government's, for example, you can find a matching scenario in their price system and use a more tailored carbon price. But for the bog standard UK targets, they're again looking in that sort of 100 odd pounds per tonne. All of these, though, sort of pale in comparison as to what Levitt Bernstein recommended to 18 London boroughs quite recently, which was that they should be aiming for about £880 per tonne if they can get away with it, because that's what they see as the most plausible way of getting net zero within the public sector, which is obviously a much higher number than the rest of them. And the reason I want to see these as benchmarks is you can just sort of pluck one out and use it and say that's one we're going to go for. That's a perfectly valid route. But you can also sort of calculate your own based on previous net zero projects, stuff you've got planned in your pipeline, and use these external benchmarks. Say, well, our number is 174, let's say, and that's quite similar to the rest of them. So we know that it's okay. And going through that process, you can get some weird numbers that get thrown up on you. So here's a little graph of some of the numbers that we pulled up for Hull and East Yorkshire that range from negative 5,000 and something to positive 6,000 and something. So you can see there's a bit of a range here. But if you look in that middle section of a graph, if you're looking somewhere between 50 and 350 pounds per tonne of carbon, that's probably the right ballpark to be thinking of at the moment. And as for the Hull and East Yorkshire, what we have chosen to go with as an initial trial is that non-traded price from the UK government's Green Book. And you can see in 2024 that ranges from £128 to £384 per tonne of carbon, increasing as we get to net zero by 2050. So that's what the price is. That's sort of how to think about setting it. But how might you think about using it? Well, again, here there are two options really. There's the shadow price approach, which is all about using your internal carbon price as an informational tool for decision makers. So they might get given two versions of a project, a high carbon and a low carbon version. And they will look at that and say, the low carbon version is probably going to cost a bit more. But given that it saves an amount of CO2 over the lifetime of that project, what is that? What does that calculate as? What is that project's pounds per CO2 ratio? And is that higher or lower than the benchmark that we've set as an internal carbon price? And if it's lower, it gives the decision makers a sort of a nice solid reason to go with that more expensive but lower carbon option. But if it's higher, if you've got a project where to get it to a lower carbon version, you're looking at £1,000 per tonne, that's a reasonable rationale for decision makers to say, not this time, you're going to have to figure out how to offset or inset that those emissions another way. The more hardcore way to go about it is to say we're going to do it through an internal carbon tax, and that's going to be levied on every single tonne of CO2 emitted as a result of the decision making. So whether it's 1 tonne or 1,000 tonnes that your project is emitting, we're going to levy this tax. And let's say you've got an internal carbon price of £150 per tonne. You've got a project coming down the line that's going to emit 1,000 tonnes over its lifetime. You can say to those project developers, that team, well, we're going to need £150,000 from you to put into this sort of net zero pot of money. And that's where you can splash out the money for your offsetting and for your insetting projects to alleviate the emissions that are coming through from those projects that get to that tax. Now, that can be quite a sort of a moment for some colleagues. So that number, the internal carbon price you use for a tax, probably has to be lower than the shadow price number, but you do get an awful lot more control with that number through the tax system. So where could we use both the shadow price and the carbon tax approach? Well, one perhaps really optimal route for using it is in the capital approval process of new projects. And that's really optimal because as part of capital projects, you are probably locking yourself into carbon emissions further down the line. You're going to have, let's say, a new leisure centre going through the process that is going to lock you into 50 tonnes of carbon by 2050. You can say, hang on, no, we've got that target. That can't be 50 tonnes in 2050. It has to come down. So you're either going to have to spend money in 2050 to alleviate that, or you can spend a bit of money now so we don't have that problem in the future. And that's your rationale for doing it with those longer term projects in the capital process. And also within the capital process, you have these perfect sort of gateway or checkpoint processes. Every organization tends to have a different sort of process and mechanism for approving capital projects, but most of them tend to have these points where you stop and you do options appraisals and cost benefit analyses. And it's relatively easy just to slip your carbon pricing processes into those stop gaps and say, add an extra couple of lines into your forms, add an extra couple of rows into your Excel spreadsheet so you can get those carbon savings, carbon emissions, and carbon cost analysis in those as well. Alternatively, or maybe additionally, you can go down the route of service-based carbon pricing as well in the next slide. So next slide, please, Katie. Thanks. No, back one. Perfect. So you can apply most of the same sort of principles to service design and service decision making, but with most of your sort of revenue service-based decisions, you're looking at a 1-2 year decision making. And this can actually be really useful if your authority has sort of interim or annual carbon targets. So you can set sort of ever increasing carbon prices. And let's say the waste department will look and say, in 2025, everything that falls below the current price gets done as a carbon saving measure, and maybe that comes at a 10% reduction. And then you increase the price, and theoretically, the amount of projects or activities that save carbon should increase over time as you meet those targets. Or you can use the decision-making process within service design to run trials of projects. And that's what we did in Scarborough back in 2022. When I was there, we were looking at using HVO to replace diesel in a lot of our heavier duty fleet. And so we said to our decision makers, our finance officers, directors, cabinet members, this is the project we want to do. It should save about 900 tonnes of carbon, but it is a trial. So we just want to do it for the first year. we think it will cost us about £168 per tonne of carbon that we're saving. Whereas the UK government, in its non-traded green book prices, thinks that we could theoretically be spending up to £248, and that's still an okay number. So we're coming under that. That's a-okay, right? And they told us that's a-okay. Crack on with it. And we were able to do that, deliver that project, and save those 900 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, which was a great stuff for a trial. So that's sort of a whistle-stop tour, really, of the concept of internal carbon pricing, why we've got to the point where we're at, and how you might use that going forward. So the next steps for us is we're going to be working with Hull City Council to trial internal carbon pricing through their capital approval process over the next year or so, and we'll be sharing updates and a review of that process as we get information back from them, and we'll be sharing that through the sort of general update feeds you should get from your net zero hubs. But we've also handily got that full scoping report that we did from the North Eastern Yorkshire Net Zero Hub up online with that 12-step guide to getting into a similar point as to where we are now, and a bit more of context as to some of the things that I've spoken about today. So that's the stop from me, and we'd love to hear more from you if you've got through similar initiatives, and we're happy to sort of share your learnings and work with you all. So thank you, that's me.
Wow, Harry, that was fantastic. Lots of magic there. And also bang on time. So I forgot to sort of talk about housekeeping just to save a bit of time. But in terms of questions, if you have a question, please put it in the chat, and I will read it out. And there we have, right on cue, a question from Yvonne Gill. Are Hull using internal carbon tax or shadow pricing? Or maybe both, I guess.
I think for this initial trial period, we want to use that shadow pricing because we think it's just going to be the things that our colleagues are more amenable to. It's less aggressive, really, than an internal tax. And we'll sort of scope it after that first year if we think colleagues are amenable to going a bit more hardcore with a tax, then we might ratchet it up a bit. But if we're getting the results that we want and we need with that shadow price, then we'll probably keep on going with that.
Okay, great. I'm just going to read them as they come. So, with many local authorities focused on balancing their books on a year-by-year basis, is it not becoming increasingly more difficult to make the case for internal carbon pricing? Very good question there from James O'Brien.
Yeah, I think that is a real challenge for us. And I think that's why you've got to be really clever in your rationalization of it. And I think that's why I talked a bit about, particularly if you've got sort of interim targets or year by year targets, it can be really effective. But you've got to make that case of, if you're making this decision now, you're committing us to so many tons of carbon next year in 2030, 2040, 2050, that at some point we're going to have to spend the money to reduce to meet the targets that we've set ourselves and we've committed to in declarations, strategies, action plans, and whatever. And if you can work out that avoiding those emissions today is cheaper than having to offset them or inset them later, maybe if it's through separate offsetting and insetting schemes today, then that's how you make the argument. And it's all about saying it's cheaper than that price threshold is how we know it's cheaper to do it today than tomorrow. And it's about finding that amenable ear to those challenges.
Okay, very good answer there. The next, Karen Gregg, could the link of the scoping report be posted in the chat, please? Yes, Katie, thank you. Alistair McPherson, what is a carbon inset? And I think Dan will go on to explain that more in the next presentation. But to keep to this topic of internal carbon pricing, Nicola, what internal resources does a council need to be able to calculate emissions on a project by project basis?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it can vary depending on where you're using your pricing mechanism, which I think is why the capital process is probably a good way to start it. Because if you're doing big fat capital projects, you're probably also sort of having an idea of what the OPEX of those projects are going to be over the long term. And that pretty much requires you to be looking at what the energy bills and the sort of the running costs of that project are going to be. So if it's, for example, that new leisure centre, then your initial feasibility designs should be looking at how to heat and the sort of building standards that you're looking at. And so your consultants in your sort of economic development or leisure centre or whatever teams that are coming up with those initial ideas, they should have numbers of how much they expect the energy bills to be and the energy usage to be. And then it's just adding in that line of, well, if you're using this much gas or this much electricity, it's a nice, easy calculation using the government's sort of carbon footprinting numbers to say it's therefore this much tons of carbon, and doing it that way. And it really shouldn't be outside of the scope or too much to ask for a couple of sort of tweaks to maybe your energy efficiency standards within a building that's being proposed in the feasibility studies, or saying, well, what give us the options of a gas boiler or a heat pump for a certain building. I think most of that should be within most sort of the feasibility studies that are being conducted already for large capital projects. If you're going down the sort of service design and decision making route, that's where it can get a bit more tricky, and you have to be a bit smarter about understanding how different decision making and practices actually result in real world impacts on carbon. And that's probably where you are going to have to sort of dedicate a bit of resource, a bit of manpower into understanding that. And that's probably where you're going to need maybe sort of 0.1, 0.2 of an FTE to look at things.
Okay. From Yvonne, do you have an example of an organization who has set up an internal carbon tax, or is it too soon? I could give a sort of private sector example, but Yvonne, Harry, have you got an example? You did actually mention it was probably a bit too, I don't know if you use the word aggressive, but to do both. But is there an example of a local authority who's also thinking of an internal carbon tax or levy?
I think there are a couple of local authorities around the patch who have done sort of small scale and limited carbon taxes for specific bits of work. So for large scale capital projects, for example. But I think there are a couple of universities, I think it might be Yale University over in America, and some of the big tech companies have started to have an internal carbon tax as part of their decision making process within the private sector. There's a whole host of sort of examples in that full report, which I'll spread the link to on the chat, that I can't remember off the top of my head. But it would be quite a novel thing to sort of implement it in a relatively large scale within the public sector in the UK.
Great, and I think that this report will really sort of start the ball rolling. But Yvonne, I can give you an example from Hong Kong. Big conglomerate called Swires. They're doing internal carbon pricing with Coca-Cola, which they own, and also Swire Properties, and they're looking at both a carbon fee and a shadow carbon price. So they are sharing all of their findings online. So do have a look. But I think, Harry, the point that you brought up, there is a big difference between an internal carbon levy or tax, let's say £22 versus 138 for the ICP. So how do you get these two to balance out? And ultimately, I think the really important point around the levy is that it will create this net zero funding pot for some of the projects that we're going to go on to describe. So how is the rationale between there being such a big difference in amounts between the levy and the ICP?
I think at the end of the day, it's about what you think you can get away with. Get away with is probably the wrong wording, but what you think can be effectively implemented within your organization. If you've got quite a forward-thinking organization that is quite happy to use quite a high price, then that's probably a better angle. But if you've got an organization where you think no matter how high you put it or low you put it, that they're going to be quite resistant. It's all about trying to understand what your stakeholders actually view as doable and plausible, and what their preferences are as well. Because you absolutely don't want to be swimming against the tide on this. You want to be playing this into the processes and into the minds of the decision makers, and sort of presenting them the options maybe, and letting them choose whether they want to go shadow or tax, and maybe with a bit of a preference from yourself if you've got one. But I think don't come into it with saying we definitely want to do it as a shadow, or we definitely want to do it as a tax. You got to go into it trying to understand the processes and the views of your stakeholders in your organizations.
Okay, thank you, Harry. And we've got to the end of time for the questions. So apologies to Sophie, Margaret, Sarah, Karen and all the others, Cara, lots and lots more questions. I'm really sorry that we don't have time for them, but you have Harry's email there. Sorry, Harry. I'm sure he'll be delighted to answer them. But great questions. Thank you very much. And brilliant presentation there from Harry. I would now like us to hear from Dan Wrench, who is the Climate and Carbon Project Officer at Shropshire Council. Are you there, Dan?
I'm here. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Yes.
Brilliant.
Okay. Yes, I get on. Yeah, I'm as Kira says, I'm at Shropshire Council. My role within the council is around carbon sequestration. So just a bit of an introduction to where we are. So we declared an emergency in May 2019 and adopted a strategy in 2020. And as part of that, we said we're going to be carbon net zero by 2030, and that included scope 3. Now we've moved on a few years. I think that is a bit of a stretch target, and we may have to kind of revisit that, include it for the scope 3 side of things, but you never know. So our team has leaders on power up side of things, so looking at renewable energy production, and we want to be self-sufficient in energy by 2030. Power down, so reduction in emissions from buildings and transport, and as I said, my area, carbon capture and storage. So this is a sort of practical example, I suppose, of insetting. Next slide, yeah, thank you. So this is a slide copied from some work and thesis have done and we've been involved with. So as many of you probably know, there's this, it was originally called authority-based insetting, but it's now area-based insetting. And there's been various phases of that work. We were involved in phase 1 and phase 2 of that particular project. So this is a slide, a very busy slide, I'm afraid, but it just describes the differences between offsetting and insetting and area-based insetting. So offsetting, you can offset your carbon credits wherever in the world. You know, it could be protecting the Amazon forest or buying stoves for a developing world or whatever. Insetting, you're looking at reducing emissions within your supply chain, and area-based insetting, you're looking at reducing emissions within a geographic area, like your local authority area, and that could also be reducing emissions within your organisation and your supply chain, as well as long as those are within that geographic area. So next slide, please. So yeah, as I said, we work with Anthesis and several other local authorities on developing this framework for insetting within the local authority. We put forward several different projects which we felt showed good promise for reducing carbon emissions, and 3 of those are worked up by Anthesis into more detailed figures that investors could, in theory, purchase those offsets, those insets. There were some difficulties, and we actually run out of funding to sort of engage with the 3rd phase of that particular project. So we still have our projects worked up and on the Anthesis registry, but we need to do some more work to tidy those up and produce some more realistic figures on a price per ton. But effectively, there's dots on a map, and if you go on to the next slide, there's the CO2 savings and funding gaps. So in Shropshire, if you kind of go onto the Anthesis registry, there's 3 points on there, 1 for tree planting, 1 for building retrofit, and the 3rd one, which is just off the page there, which is about pyrolysis. And in the course of looking at pyrolysis as an option for insetting, it piqued our interest quite a lot. There seemed to be a lot of potential. So a basic for those who don't know what pyrolysis is, it's heating materials, in this case biomass, at high temperatures without oxygen. And what happens there is the oils and gases get driven off, and what you're left with is carbon, essentially. So charcoal is made exactly the same way, but this pyrolysis produces, in our case, we're looking for biochar because we don't want to burn the resulting carbon as you do with charcoal. So if you burn the oils and gases that come off, you are left with, you can generate energy, and some of that powers the system, some of it can be fed to the grid or other off-takers. So the sort of biomass we're looking for, is compost oversize. So that's the stuff that doesn't get composted down during the first process of composting through composting green bin waste and those sorts of things, and some other biomasses. Chipped roadside trees. We've got a lot of trees that are dying with ash dieback, so there's a large resource there. And also grass cuttings from road verges and parks and so forth can be pyrolyzed. Scrub, bracken, gorse. You can even use sewage sludge and food waste, but that usually has to be combined with wood chip. How it does it, I suppose this is, most of you will know this anyway, but in the left hand diagram there, we've got atmospheric CO2 that gets stored by plants, but then those plants get degrade or burn. That CO2 is returned to the atmosphere. On the right hand side, pyrolysis intercepts that kind of carbon cycle. 50% of the carbon in the biomass gets turned to the biochar. The rest is as part of the gases and oil that come off. Those are burnt, and then 50% of that carbon goes back into the atmosphere, unless you have a CO2 scrubber, which I know some of the systems now have. So there's loads of different scales of production. This is a very basic scale, domestic scale of biochar production, and a simple form of pyrolysis. Next one, I've got one of these at home, works very well with the compost. There's slightly larger ones where the previous one we've purchased about 7 of those for loan to community groups, just sort of as an educational thing more than an inset idea. We have 3 of these for the council, which we are considering accounting for the carbon that these store, because they do store reasonable amounts of carbon. You could store maybe about the equivalent of 8 tons of CO2 per year with these, and you have a product at the end of it that can be sold as a soil amendment and so forth. So next slide. But the one we're really interested in is the sort of larger scale or medium scale sort of systems like this. This is there are quite a lot available. Most of them are sort of German manufacturers by Pyreg or Biomacon. There's a local producer called Woodtech who've made this this system. They've been operating a demonstrator for the last 4 years and have been producing large amounts of biochar and carbon credits, which they've been selling via the Puro Earth platform. Under the name Carbon Hill, if anyone's interested. So they're one of the largest providers of carbon removal credits for the UK at the moment, just through the production of biochar. So this new system that they've just been producing, this one produces, no, can you go back one, sorry? So this, backward slide, yeah, so this is producing large amounts of biochar. So that's, you can see the figures, yeah, 1,600 tons of carbon credits a year at least. And as comparison, if we had 2 of these units, that would negate our direct carbon emissions. And so we're aiming to get more than 2 of these units, but we've got one coming very soon. And it produces energy, so it's carbon negative energy in effect. So yeah, we identified pyrolysis fairly early on as a way of helping reach net zero with durable CO2 emissions, CO2 removal. We do plant trees as well. We've been planted about 102,000 since 2020. But who knows what's going to happen to those trees if disease or fire or drought impacts those. We know that with biochar, you put it in the soil or you put it in materials, it gets locked there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So we feel that's a more durable form. And so, yeah, globally, biochar carbon removal credits don't get much of the funding, only about 7%, but actually they deliver over 92% of the current retired credits. So it's seen as a here and now technology. There's all this direct air capture stuff, which is hugely expensive, very technological, and doesn't really deliver at the moment. I personally feel that this pyrolysis could be, a huge component of carbon removal, more than enhanced rock weathering or other techniques. So I put a paper together to Shropshire Council, which was approved. So we've got 2 million to purchase our own pyrolysis unit, which, according to our figures on sales of the biochar, the carbon credits, and the energy, it should pay for itself in under 5 years. If we're paid to take green waste as well, that comes down even further. So we as part of this process, we did engage with Woodtech, who produces that large machine I looked at earlier on, and they were seeking investment to buy one of their own units to work at their own plant. So we established a joint venture with them, so to allow them to purchase their own unit. So we're now got a sort of foot in the market, so we can better understand the carbon credit market and how where those are sold and who they're sold to. And also the biochar market as well, which is still fairly nascent, but still people are still having to import biochar for uses in things like asphalt and so forth. So next slide, please. Yes, so as I said before, just 2 of these units would negate our scope 1 and 2, but we'd need quite a few to negate our scope 3, unfortunately, at the moment. So at the moment, we are selling the credits just to help reinvest in other pyrolysis units. But come 2030 or before, we may well be using these credits to offset or inset our own emissions. There's a potential that our Northwest Relief Road, if it ever happens, needs to secure local offset credits. So it may well be that the credits we generate through pyrolysis will be used partly to offset that. But yeah, I think that will also need several pyrolysis units. Next slide, please.
Dan, we're coming towards the end of
Okay.
your...
Yeah, okay, I'll wash through then. So yeah, there's been lots of interest. We published a paper, lots of interest from local authorities, farming community, biochar can hold on to water, nutrients, and so forth, and it's like activated charcoal. We've got pilots looking at carbon neutral asphalt, and high energy users who can use the heat, like Bridgenorth Aluminium, have also expressed an interest because it's carbon negative energy and it's their bills are crazy. So next slide. I think that's possibly it, or close to being it. Oh, sorry, one little more. I'll try and skip through. Yeah, so we've completed this JV. We're going to get some first-hand experience in pyrolysis. There's our next unit is going to be going in Ludlow in 2025, and we're setting up a framework. So we've learned lots of lessons along the way. So we'll be setting up a framework of how to do it yourself for other local authorities, because like I say, there's been about 14 other local authorities been in touch, and we may be setting up joint ventures with other local authorities and businesses like poultry farms. So, but we do hope to re-engage with the area-based insetting, because it might bring in be a good mechanism for attracting other external investment. Okay, next one. I think that's it. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Wow. Thanks so much, Dan. That was really very interesting. I'm going to go straight to the questions. One from Cara. Great to see the biochar progress with Shropshire Council. Do you also biochar grass cuttings?
There have been trials on grass cuttings, yes. It's usually best to combine it. There's another project called Greenprint, who are focusing on that specifically with South Gloucestershire and West Sussex, I believe. So we'll learn more about how they've fared with that one. But that's a great resource in terms of managing our road verges, yeah.
Okay, so are there any more questions? I can see some comments. You mentioned, Dan, in terms of the cost, was it 1.5 million?
Yeah.
Yeah, so sort of linking up to what Harry said, and this is absolutely the business case for the internal carbon levy or tax to be able to buy one of these large scale units, which, as you said, are covering your scope 1 and 2, which is fantastic. Okay, so I'm just looking at some of the questions. Are there any questions? Somerset Council is also looking at this. That's from Cara. Cara, that's really question here. Have any studies been done? Sorry, Ian Lloyd. Have any studies been done for people employing this type of technology for a non-agricultural environment, or would that be seen as a distraction to business as usual operations, i.e. new facilities and building on premises? So, Ian, I hope that's what you wanted to say. If not, put on your camera and just ask the question yourself. Did you get that question, Dan? Have studies been done for people employing this type of technology for a non-agricultural environment? Or would
Yeah.
that be seen as a business as usual, a distraction to business as usual?
No, I mean it does work for heating, district networks and district heat networks and so forth, provided you can get the biomass into the area you're looking at. So yeah, that would work in other areas. Yeah, yeah. It's all about, can you get the biomass to site, and can you make sure that there are very few emissions from these plants, but still there's a perception that it's an incinerator, and it's not at all. And they're far, they're very clean operations and quiet operations. But there are certainly concerns that do get flagged up by local residents if it's in an urban area.
Okay, thank you. A question from Annalise. What mechanisms are you using to sell those credits? Do you mean on ABI or outside of that?
At the moment, it's outside of that. So we have, our first joint venture will be just piggybacking on the back of Woodtech, who currently sell their carbon credits via the Puro Earth platform and under the name Carbon Hill. So, but I would quite like actually to set up a separate sort of name, which would include a lot of other local authorities and sell carbon credits that have been badged under, all from local authorities. I think that would be a nice little venture. But yeah, we could find, we could go our own way and use our own broker. But quite often buyers like to buy in bulk rather than going to several smaller buyers. So at the moment, that's why we're sticking with Carbon Hill.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Is there a good market for biochar in the UK? Asked Jenny Allen.
It's a very good question. I wouldn't say it's a good established market at the moment. No, there's a lot of interest in agriculture. There's a lot of interest in materials. So I managed to talk one of our road surfacing subcontractors into trialing it, and so Miles McAdam now use it, and at the moment they're having to import their biochar from Namibia. So they are chomping at the bit to try and get hold of some of our biochar. So at the minute, the few producers there are at the moment aren't having any problems in selling their biochar. There are companies that mix it with compost and sell it as a soil improver, people like Carbon Gold, and they seem to be doing quite well, selling it at huge prices. So it might have to come down a little bit. But yeah, that's something we're going to be finding out with our first joint venture.
Okay, wonderful. And then from Cara, is there a link to your paper to the council on biochar carbon reduction benefits? You'll add that in.
Yeah, I can add that. Yeah, I can put that in the chat here if you like. A link to well, I can link you to the council paper, which was asking for the 2 million.
Okay, and then a couple of people, Cara again and Tom Jarman, are talking about the link to road building materials. But Dan, presumably once you stop speaking, you'll look at some of these questions. So, okay, I'm just seeing if there are any questions I may have missed out. This is from Lynn. Hi, Dan. Really interesting. I would be keen to know more and to see the business case that you would have worked with to get the initial investment of 1.5 million. It would be great if you could share that. And Lynn gives her email.
Put it in the chat now.
Okay, and Margaret says, really good to have a local authority carbon credit store. Yeah, I agree. I think that is a very good idea. Okay, so just finally, my question would be that you mentioned in your previous slide that you plan to be linking this more to insetting. What are your plans there?
Well, at the moment, as I said, we'll be selling the credits, but I really think that I mean, looking at the example from Harry and so forth, I mean, if we can start working out exactly how much we need to inset to completely cover our scope 3. I'd like to look at the figures on how much we can get that price down to. I mean, at the minute, carbon credits for biochar sell for around £120 a ton. It's very variable though. It's quite a bit more, sometimes a little bit less. But I also think that once we've got this as an example, we can. There's a lot of businesses, a lot of agricultural businesses in Shropshire. So I'd like to be able to encourage those businesses to follow this lead and produce their own. Certainly, if it becomes used more widely in agriculture, which I think it will do, because it holds on to the nutrients and prevents people spending a fortune on fertilizers and so forth. So that's where that sort of investment locally can come.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for a brilliant presentation. I would now like to, and also everyone, thank you for your questions. Delighted to introduce Krista Patrick from Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and he is the Natural Capital Coordinator, and we'll be talking about investing in nature to cool climate, create jobs, and boost public health. So over to you, Krista.
Well, thanks very much. And yeah, I'm just going to do a whistle-stop tour now of how we've been looking at investing in nature in Greater Manchester. And obviously, our 5-year environment plan has an ambitious target around being carbon neutral by 2038. And we have declared both biodiversity and climate emergencies, and the two go hand in hand. So it's very much in terms of nature forms a key part of our priorities in terms of delivering our solutions for being net zero by 2038. And we've been on a natural capital journey over the past, I would say since 2016, when I joined the authority, where we were an urban pioneer project, which was 4 areas in the country where we were supporting the delivery of natural capital approaches by the government's 25-year environment plan. So we were the urban pioneer, and there were 3 other pioneers in the country. So we have, over this kind of duration, been kind of testing various different approaches of how we look at valuing our the nature and natural environment, and how we can look at innovative finance models for nature. So next slide, please. So one of the key deliverables as part of the urban pioneer was to look at innovative finance models, and in kind of establishing and implementing a natural capital investment plan to look at how we mobilize existing and new sources of funding was one of those key outcomes from the Urban Pioneer project, but also from the Mayor's first Green Summit, when the Mayor came into being, kind of 2018, we had a Green Summit, and one of the outcomes was there, right, we do need to look at how we do kind of generate innovative forms of investment in our natural environment, and therefore we were given the kind of go ahead to produce a natural capital investment plan. And I think the key thing about the plan is effectively, lots of parts of society and communities, businesses benefit from nature, but without directly paying for them. So there are innovative finance models out there in which revenues can be generated, and as a result, mechanisms can be delivered that attract a wider range of private sector and alternative sources of funding. Next slide. So the basis for this really is that, in order to deliver our environmental objectives and ambitions in our 5-year environment plan, we still need a significant amount of additional funding to develop and deploy local nature-based solutions and other types of interventions. Much of that investment will need to come from non-public sources. So traditionally, we've relied on, public sources of funding, whether or not that's from government or from local government, and also philanthropic funding. But that in itself is insufficient alone to meet the funding gap that we need to protect Greater Manchester's natural environment. So, often public funds are segregated and managed independently, preventing kind of, strategic allocation for target projects. Nature-based solutions, currently draw on limited funding resources and tend to suffer from a lack of proven business models, project scale and aggregation, and accountability and governance in terms of, kind of those arrangements, but also valuing the benefits provided by green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. So there's an urgent need to attract new sources of funding from the private sector. And so next slide, please. So what we're trying to do here through the Natural Capital Investment Plan is look at outside of the public sector investment in natural capital, has kind of traditionally drawn on philanthropic sources. So we look at this diagram here, and those philanthropic short sources are shown to the left of the dotted line, with grants, being the main form of investment. So what we're trying to do with the natural capital investment plan is work our way to the right, probably not right to the far right, where you've got your mainstream investors that are looking at, whether or not that's your kind of mainstream charges in terms of return on investment. But we're now starting to look at how do we, kind of start to kind of bundle up public sector with philanthropic and with private sector impact investment. And that's the kind of key thing for us really, is to look at that impact in investment. So some, for those impact investors, some financial returns are necessary and often require some kind of blended finance. So they're looking at a combination of funds for risk sharing. So they might not perhaps charge as much in terms of mainstream investors, but will still want some kind of return on their investment. Next slide, please. So moving on from that, one of the key recommendations from the Natural Capital Investment Plan was around setting up an investment fund, and that kind of natural capital investment fund would be there to help bring forward the financial models that could actually help invest in these alternative funding models. So effectively, we set up the Greater Manchester Environment Fund, which would act as a suitable vehicle to provide that kind of appropriate governance and strategic support. Next slide. So the GM Environment Fund was launched in 2021. And that's really designed to match innovative nature-based solutions and projects on the ground with sustainable investment opportunities so that we can grow a greener Greater Manchester. And the next slide shows, the kind of a very broad idea of the mechanism here to align those funding sources. And I'm not going to go into this in detail because we've got lack of time now, but effectively the GM Environment Fund is a charitable vehicle. It's managed by Lancashire Wildlife Trust, so they provide the technical expertise, the local network and the experience in running this charitable vehicle for fund deployment. It arranges and collates a range of non-restricted funds, so those might be public and philanthropic sources that don't necessarily have ties in them in terms of what they can be spent on. So effectively, they're public sector funds or philanthropic funds that are, to be spent on, kind of natural environment projects. But then you've got restricted funds. So those are ones where there are kind of specific requirements there about what they can be spent and how. And again, what we're trying to do is create different pots for those. So effectively, we've got these different pots. We've got these different, kind of, you could call them special purpose vehicles. And the next slide kind of just shows our funding horizons. So the primary aim at the moment and focus is, to the left, top left, we're still, focusing on pump priming those investment models through public and philanthropic grants. So we've been fortunate to have received, kind of Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund from DEFRA, but also look at corporate funding programs. So we've got a £200,000 per annum commitment from Suez as part of our waste disposal contract to put into recycling, local community recycling projects. But also on the top, the bottom left there, we're really focusing on, biodiversity net gain, creating and delivering a habitat bank facility, but also a carbon mitigation facility, primarily through, kind of tree planting, but also restoration of our peatlands. But we also want to start in the medium and long term looking at other areas. So, we're kind of still developing this. But the next slide just shows, the impact at the moment. So, just through aggregating projects and pulling together different partners, different NGOs, we've been really successful in terms of, getting funding, a couple of years ago from the Green Recovery Challenge Fund, 1.8 million. But more recently, we've got 2.6 million from the Mayor's Green Spaces Fund to actually give grants out for local communities to actually deliver spaces and green projects in the areas that are needed most, particularly as a result of COVID, but also those that don't have equal space access to green space. So whilst these are all still grant funded projects, we've been able to lever these in because of aggregating this fund at scale and kind of providing the impact that we can deliver through that. And the last slide really is just a couple of links there to our outputs. in terms of the investment plan, the funding strategy, the investment strategy is a really good resource. So I'd suggest you have a look at that. That's got all the detail in there. But also to the right, you've got your Green Finance Institute Investment Readiness Toolkit, the key stages you need to go through to actually bring forward a natural environment project to market. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Well, brilliant. I first came across Krista. I was overseeing a Cumbria Green Investment Plan. There is a chapter there also on nature-based solutions. But I think it's fair to say the work that Greater Manchester is doing in this sort of natural capital investment is, there's real leadership there. So congratulations. Do we have some questions? I can't see any. So that then puts me on my toes. So, okay, so let's talk about investor readiness. So this is obviously key. So often when people talk about green finance, they will say, oh, there's a great wall of capital out there. But the issue is that these projects are not yet investor ready. That's the key problem. So how are you approaching that within? I know there's the toolkit that you mentioned coming from the Green Finance Institute, but how are you actually thinking about investor readiness?
Yeah, I think the key thing here is about getting those robust business cases, so that actually you can go out to market and sell those units and actually then provide a robust way of actually repaying those investors, because if you actually haven't got a product to sell at market, then you're not going to be able to repay those investors. So that kind of green snake kind of Green Finance Institute steps is really important, because actually you need to do a lot of your homework at the start in terms of, well, what is the market out there? Is there a demand? So biodiversity net gain units, how many developments are coming through the system? So we carried out a biodiversity net gain need and supply assessment to understand actually what's the demand out there, and we've kind of worked out there's probably about a demand for £9 million worth of biodiversity net gain units a year. So from new developments coming forward. So now we're working with not only third-party offset providers to provide a verification process for them to bring forward sites, but we're working with our local authorities to bring forward their own sites. And that's the key thing there really, is how we kind of provide the evidence to do that.
Okay, so Krista, I know you need to go at 2, and it is 2 now. So I'll just, I'm sorry that we can't do more questions for Krista, and I'll just quickly do a wrap up. So it's quite difficult to wrap up when there's been so many brilliant presentations, but one of my heroes is a guy called Guy Shrubsole, who's written all sorts of different books and things, but he did look at who owns England in 2020 and before then, and he did say that actually the local authorities own some 1.3 million acres of land in England. So that's not just what you'd expect it to be in terms of county halls, public parks, highways, etc. But it's moorlands, it's salt marshes, green belt, and lots of foreshore, and of course all of those different golf courses. So when we're thinking about area-based insetting, there is a huge amount to think about. 1.3 million acres is significant. And then moving on to the sort of internal carbon price and the shadow price and the levy, well, clearly there are opportunities to be creating more of a funding pot that is needed. And I really think that the project that Dan spoke about in terms, what great potential for different local authorities to have their own pyrolysis. So I just wanted to end by saying thank you very much to everyone for coming to this webinar. It's been fascinating, lots and lots of questions from you all. And thank you again to Katie Clark behind the scenes, just making it all work. So thank you again to our speakers. Thanks very much.